The murderer on Christmas night. Christmas is usually a time of peace and joy, but sometimes it's when the strangest and most terrifying things can happen. The story is about when I was a child. At that time, to be honest, Christmas wasn't my favorite holiday. Sure, the gifts, food, and Santa Claus were great, but somehow, all of that always felt empty to me. While everyone was gathered talking, I went to the dining room to play alone, and that's when everything started. At that time, I thought maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but I swear I saw someone through the window. A shadow passed by the window, just for a second. It was a person, but their face wasn't normal. The man wore a grotesque, demon-like mask. I froze in place. I moved closer to the window to see better, but there was nothing there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Then, suddenly, the man lunged forward with the mask, his mouth twisted into a wide, grotesque grin. He gently tapped on the window and pointed at the front door. After that, he moved away from the window and walked toward the front door. A few seconds later, someone began knocking on the door. I ran to warn my dad, but he brushed it off, thinking it was just Uncle Henry bringing in beer. He even joked that I was probably imagining everything because I was bored. My dad hesitated as he stepped toward the door, reluctantly opening it. It was Uncle Henry, which confused me even more. I didn't know what was going on. Despite Uncle Henry's comforting presence, the strange feeling I had didn't go away. I didn't know what to say anymore. I was scared, but my dad seemed to think it was just a prank. My body trembled as I went back upstairs, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the doorknob, trapping myself in my room, trying to escape the growing fear inside me. As night fell, and the family gathered outside to watch the fireworks, I stayed inside, staring out of my bedroom window at the bright lights. Suddenly, someone began knocking on my room door. I was about to open it when I realized something was wrong. I looked back out the window. My mom, dad, grandparents, and uncle were all downstairs. So, who was knocking on the door? I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. I paused for a second, then looked through the peephole. It wasn't my parents. It was him, the man wearing the demon mask. His voice was deep, but I could still hear it clearly. There was no mistaking it. He insisted that I let him in, promising me horrors if I refused. He even taunted me, threatening to kill me like he had with other children. Terrified, the first refused to open the door, only to hear the door starting to splinter as the masked man tried to break in. I screamed for help, but they outside didn't know the danger lurking inside. In a desperate attempt to cry for help, at the same time, my parents struggled to open the locked back door, which had been mysteriously sealed from the inside. They were panicked, unable to get into the house. As the masked man continued pounding on the door, I watched in horror as the wood began to crack. He was close to getting in, and I could feel my life slipping away. The door shattered, and the man, his face still hidden behind the grotesque demon mask, stepped into the room. He grabbed my neck with terrifying strength. My body writhed, trying to escape his grip. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought this was it. But then, a loud crash sounded from outside the window. He looked up for a moment, distracted. My dad realized the severity of the situation, climbed the ladder to the window, and threw a rock through it. The glass shattered. Without hesitation, my dad climbed through the broken window and rushed into the room just in time to pull him away. He didn't stop there, though. He took a knife and lunged toward my dad. My dad tried to dodge the strike, but the blade grazed his shoulder painfully. Still, he pushed forward. As my dad desperately fought to subdue him, I grabbed a metal lamp from the bedside table and struck him on the head. He staggered back, dazed. Outside, the sound of sirens could finally be heard. We were saved at last. When they caught the man, he referred to himself as the Grinch. They said he was responsible for many child disappearances around my age, and some bodies had been found and buried in his backyard. Since that day, many months later, I still see a therapist because of that man. Every time I sleep, I dream about what would have happened if I hadn't locked my door. I survived, yes, but the nightmares will never leave me. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room, and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. The mystery of the dolls. Her name is Mari. She was on her way to Manor Street, covered in thick fog. Siri's voice alerted, "You have arrived at your destination." The silhouette of the mansion slowly emerged from the fog. Perched on a hill, surrounded by strange 18th century architecture, it looked like something from a nightmare, making her uneasy. She parked her car a block away and walked the rest of the way. The Coopers were an old, wealthy family, and tonight, she was babysitting their 10-year-old daughter. Mrs. Cooper had explained over the phone that their regular babysitter had an emergency, and they were willing to pay her triple her usual rate. The offer was too generous to refuse. As soon as she stepped in, Mrs. Cooper, a pale and frail woman, greeted her on the porch with a forced smile. She told her, "Bridget is upstairs. I've left instructions on the table. Please, don't bother her too much." Mrs. Cooper kept glancing around, as if there was something she couldn't tell Mari. Mari walked down the dark, seemingly endless hallway. She followed the instructions left for her, leading to the room at the end of the corridor. When she entered, she saw Bridget sitting in the middle of the room. Her large black eyes seemed too old for her face. She was clutching a porcelain doll, its face eerily lifelike. She greeted Bridget, but Bridget remained silent, her eyes fixed on the doll. The room was filled with dolls, porcelain faces, shiny hair, all meticulously arranged around the room. Mari shuddered at how real their hair looked. She tried to engage Bridget with stories and games, but the girl remained eerily silent. Hours passed in strange silence until finally, around 10 p.m., Bridget said she was sleepy. Mari led Bridget to the bedroom, and that's when she noticed something was wrong. The girl began moving toward the dolls, saying, "They are my slaves." She could hardly believe her ears. She never expected something like that to come from a child. She knew she needed to keep a closer eye on the girl. By 2 a.m., she had dozed off on the couch. A sudden noise startled her awake. She groggily rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything, when she realized someone was standing behind her. She thought it was Bridget. She couldn't believe her eyes. The girl's face was twisted, her features deformed, aging grotesquely. She clutched the doll tightly in her hands and muttered, "I like your eyes. I will have them." Fear gripped her as Bridget lunged at her with an unnatural strength for a child. She fell to the floor, the weight of Bridget's small body pinning her down. She screamed in vain as Bree's hands scratched her face. "I will take your eyes," Bridget hissed, her voice rasping as if it belonged to someone else. The girl began pulling at a handful of her hair wildly, gleefully. With all her strength, she shoved the child off. She ran down the long hallway, glancing back to see Bridget enraged, chasing her madly. In desperation, she grabbed a decorative figure from a side table and hurled it at Bridget. It struck her forehead, and Bridget screamed in pain, staggering back. But it wasn't enough to stop her. She ran until she burst through the front door, flagging down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by her disheveled appearance, helped her get to the nearest police station. When she returned to the mansion with the police, the truth revealed was more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. Bridget wasn't a little girl. The woman she had been babysitting was a dwarf, Mrs. C, Cooper's deformed sister, whose body never grew but whose mind had twisted into something monstrous over the years. She often comes to the mansion, kills them in their sleep, and collects what she likes. But what she likes the most is their hair. She will use it to make dolls. the police uncovered 7 bodies in the backyard, all young women, all missing their hair. The porcelain dolls in Bridget's room were adorned with their scalps, their hair meticulously attached to the dolls she called her slaves. Mrs. Cooper had been covering up her sister's crimes for years, burying the bodies and protecting her in some inexplicable way. The police arrested both women. She now sat in her small apartment, still haunted by the events of that night. She no longer babysat, and just the sight of a doll made her heart race. The memory of Bridget still haunted her dreams. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlight. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and an eerie quiet surrounded the building. I was the night shift manager here. Usually things were calm, and nothing happened, just me stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the rest of the world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken by a soft knocking sound. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart behind and walked toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was expressionless, devoid of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and he couldn't stay here. As I turned to leave, a loud bang made me whip around. The man's fists pounded the glass, over and over, each hit louder and angrier than the last. This guy wasn't just some harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, threatening to call the police. Only then did he step back, his eyes still locked on me, full of rage. He slowly walked into the darkness of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to refocus on my work. 15 minutes passed. The knocking, the pounding, the man, all faded from my mind as I got lost in stocking the shelves. But then I heard metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned my cart and ran toward the front, fear swelling in my chest. My heart sank as I saw the glass door slightly ajar. The latch, the only thing keeping the door secure, was gone. Fear engulfed me as I realized what this meant. I needed to get to the office and call the police immediately. I turned to run toward the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was that man. His expression hadn't changed. It was still the same cold, deadly, furious stare. I didn't think. I just ran. I dashed through the door, with the man right behind me. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved recklessly, nearly hitting me as it came to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything turned upside down. A sudden, sharp pain erupted in the back of my head. My body stumbled forward as I collapsed onto the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything began to blur. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold asphalt. My vision faded, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the truck's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up to a pounding headache, my wrists tied tightly behind my back. The truck jolted and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I had no idea where I was. I began piecing it together. The man, the truck. I had been kidnapped. I knew I needed to act quickly. I glanced around. Inside was pitch dark, but then I saw it. A pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered pieces of metal on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I heard the guy muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the rising panic within me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I edged closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was tricky, but I managed to find a small piece of metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, scraping the metal against the ropes. Every bump in the road threatened to give me away, as the pain nearly made me cry out. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scrapes, and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced at the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake. I noticed the door lock was undone. I needed a plan. The truck slowed as it turned sharply onto a dirt road. The moment I had been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the back door open and leaped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain radiating through my body as I rolled across dirt and gravel. For a moment, I thought I couldn't move, but adrenaline surged within me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the surrounding trees. Behind me, the old van came to a halt. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart racing in my chest. Branches scratched at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush. My mind blurred between fear and survival. I could hear the man's voice. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and saw the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could reach it fast enough, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, frantically waving my arms as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed onto the road. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to respond. All I could do was whisper hoarsely, "Help." The driver took out his phone and called the police. In that haze, I could still see his shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, as if he were looking at me with eyes full of anger. But he didn't come any closer. Perhaps he knew that everything was over. I was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. I was told the man had been apprehended not far away. He had been arrested. The police assured me he would be locked up, that he wouldn't hurt anyone again. Even though I was safe, the thought lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? The fear remained, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to make it through that night shift alive. The stalker in the forest. The sun barely peeked through the dense pine trees as I drove north, my truck loaded with skiing gear and camping supplies. This time, my friend Leo and I had planned a skiing trip in a remote area, miles away from any ski resort. After a few hours of driving, I parked my truck at the base of an area that looked decent with several hills. But I stopped there because I really couldn't drive any further due to the trees. Leo and I unloaded our gear, struggling to walk a quarter mile to a clearing where we set up camp. It was an incredible amount of work with all the stuff we had to carry. In a small clearing among the trees, we pitched the tent, laid out our sleeping bags, and organized our gear. After setting up camp, we began hiking up the hill, carrying our snowboards and keeping an eye on the steep slopes. The ascent was quite challenging, but I felt thrilled as we climbed higher. We snowboarded down several slopes, one after the other. But as I neared the bottom of a slope, I lost sight of Leo. I assumed we'd meet at the base or regroup at camp. It wasn't unusual for us to take different paths down the hill. I called him on the radio, but all I got was static. Maybe he was still skiing, and had started down alone, my eyes scanned the trees for any sign of him. When I reached the base of the hill, I walked and spotted another figure emerging from the woods. A skier, wearing a mask and dressed in layers. He approached me, seeming friendly beneath the ski mask, asking where the best hills were and if we were camping. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others, and asked if I could lead him to my campsite, though I really didn't want to. I pulled out the radio again, calling Leo to let him know I would be heading back to camp soon. The device crackled, a distorted noise cutting in, but there was no response from him at all. Then the man started following me, his presence behind me making me feel uneasy. Suddenly, I started hearing static from the other end of the radio, as if someone was trying to talk to me but couldn't connect. When we finally reached the tent, something felt off. I realized I hadn't seen his wife, so I asked where she was. He didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his movements becoming increasingly strange. But for some reason, something about his snowboard and backpack caught my attention. They felt familiar. Gray, bright orange. The snowboards tightly strapped on either side. My mind raced as I remembered. Leo had the exact same ones. For a few seconds, I thought Leo was pranking me. But no, the voice was too different. He stepped within inches of me, revealing his real face and grinning maliciously. This was not Leo. Panic surged as I backed away, stumbling into the tent. I rifled through the backpack, my fingers fumbling for the flare gun. Just as I grasped it, the man grabbed my foot sticking out of the tent. Then I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my leg. A severe tingling sensation in my leg. Felt like a strong electric shock, burning, and I screamed in pain. I glanced down and saw a knife embedded deep in my thigh. A scream tore from me as I grabbed the flare gun. He stepped back, but I didn't lower the weapon. I aimed directly at him. Blood oozed from my wound, staining the snow beneath me. I demanded to know where my friend was. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he told me Leo was lying near the foot of the slope where we had been skiing. His words sent chills down my spine. He turned and sauntered away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods before I could fire a shot. My vision blurred from the pain, but I pressed down on my leg, trying to staunch the bleeding while I grabbed my phone and called 911. Just as I began to lose hope, a distant noise reached my ears. A rescue helicopter illuminated the snow-covered hills. With the little strength I had left, I fired the flare gun, the red light bursting into the sky. I mustered all my strength to tell them about Leo. He was found lying motionless on the hillside, his face pale. Blood stained his pants and the snow beneath him. A few days later, we were both recovering in the hospital, our wounds stitched up, but the memories remained vivid. We learned that our attacker was wanted for multiple assaults in remote areas, always hunting those who wandered too far from safety. Mysterious treehouse. Through the dense foliage, the silhouette of a massive, weathered treehouse emerged. The house was large, its wooden structure warped and covered in vines. The treehouse seemed forgotten by time, hidden by the surrounding forest. We had been walking for hours through the forest, the trees becoming denser the deeper we went. Everything started with my friend Cody's dog. Oddly, it had gone missing for 5 days, then returned home with a strange piece of paper in its mouth. The paper looked like a toy treasure map, so I was intrigued. Cody started climbing the ladder nailed to the tree, and from above, he called down to me, telling me to hurry up and see something. I hesitated for a moment because the house seemed suspicious and strange, but I decided to follow Cody. I slowly climbed the rickety ladder to the treehouse. The closer I got, the worse the feeling became. Now, I could see the house more clearly. Through the broken windows, I could see inside the house. It was a mess, full of dust and scattered objects, yet it felt oddly alive. It was like a place of exile. The air inside the treehouse was stifling, thick with dust and an unpleasant stench. I began to look around and noticed the mess, tattered old clothes scattered across the floor. In one corner, there was a mattress, stained with something black and terrible. As we moved further in, we saw the glimpse of a large, rusted iron cage among the debris. It seemed like no one had been here for years. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and told Cody.
There's nothing here. We should leave.
But Cody wouldn't listen. He was rummaging near the cage, curious, when suddenly he froze. His eyes widened, and his face turned pale as he said,
"We need to go. Now."
Before I could ask what happened, I heard it, a voice from below, low and raspy, full of malice. Well, look who I found. I glanced out the window. A man was standing at the base of the tree, looking up at us with a sinister grin. His face was gaunt, his eyes wild, his hair long and dirty, as if he had been living in the forest for too long. Cody wasted no time and shouted,
"My dad's a cop. He's coming any minute."
The man's grin faded, and his eyes narrowed as he started to threaten that if we were lying, he wouldn't spare us. Cody was below, near the ladder, ready to run, but I was stuck because the rope ladder behind his house was about to break. If he comes up here, I won't have anywhere to go. I backed away from the window, inching closer to where the cage appeared in the darkness. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. My back hit the cold metal of the cage, and I felt something move behind me. Something alive. I slowly turned around. Inside the cage, huddled in the shadows, was a person, but it looked more like a monster. Its skeletal frame was twisted and deformed, with ashen gray skin. Its eyes were bloodshot and wild. The creature stirred, its head slowly rising as it turned towards me, opening its mouth and reaching out as if to attack. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. I couldn't breathe. Cody called me out of there immediately, and without thinking, I rushed towards the ladder in front of the house, decided to climb down regardless of what was waiting for me down there. Courageous Cody used his entire body to stop that crazy guy from running towards me. Cody said run to my parents, and they'll know what to do. I'm worried, and he's behind. He told me to go quickly and come back. I followed the instructions and ran as fast as I could. I have to save him. Cody stayed behind, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. When the police arrived, everything was gone, and there was no trace of anyone. 10 years have passed since that day. I never went back to the treehouse until now. The memories came flooding back as I stood at the edge of the forest, looking up at the towering oak where the treehouse still stood, weathered and decaying. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old Blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." The Window Stalker. It all started that day when I was just a child, too young to fully comprehend the horror that was about to unfold. Our home was always cozy, with large windows in the living room that overlooked the beautiful garden outside. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, fully immersed in my favorite TV show. My mother was in the kitchen, doing her usual chores, but then something caught my attention. In the reflection of the TV screen, I saw the silhouette of a man. I could see him through the glass, standing motionless in the garden behind me. I thought it was probably my dad, so I didn't turn around. I called out, "Horror story about a truck driver." As soon as I said that, I saw my mom freeze and then rush into the living room. When my mom saw the figure standing outside the window, her face went blank. I had never seen her look so terrified. I turned around. There he was, a stranger, a scruffy man with wild eyes, just standing there staring at us with a sick, twisted grin. He didn't seem to care that he had been spotted. He just smiled wider, almost enjoying the fear he was causing in my mother and me. Without hesitation, my mom yelled, threatening to call the police if he came closer, but I could sense her fear. And then he said something that still chills me to this day. He growled through the glass with a menacing voice, "If you touch that phone, I'll break this window, and neither of you will be safe." My mom hesitated, torn between calling for help and protecting me, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flared with anger as he fumbled with something inside his coat. And then, in the blink of an eye, he lunged toward the back door. I heard him pounding on it, frantically rattling the doorknob. Thank God it was locked. His frustration turned into rage. He screamed, demanding to be let in, threatening that if he got inside, he wouldn't spare us. I was too young to fully grasp the danger we were in. My mom grabbed me, pulling me off the couch, and we ran upstairs. We didn't stop until we reached the top floor, and that's when I saw my uncle, my mom's younger brother. My uncle was standing in the hallway, headphones on, completely unaware of the chaos downstairs. He was a big, muscular man, the kind you wouldn't want to mess with. He used to compete in boxing matches and had won several trophies. My uncle, confused, asked, "What's going on?" as my mom frantically explained. And just as she finished, we heard the man's voice again, coming from downstairs. His voice echoed through the house, saying, "The boogeyman is coming to get you." Those words were etched into my memory. My uncle heard him and told us to lock ourselves in the bathroom and call the police. My mom pulled me into the bathroom, locked the door as instructed, and called 911. I could hear the man downstairs, his voice growing more erratic. Then, the sound of glass shattering echoed throughout the house. My mom and I held our breath, frozen in fear, waiting for what felt like an eternity for something to happen. We waited and prayed that it was over. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. We braced ourselves, fearing the worst. My uncle slowly stepped out of his hiding spot, waiting for the perfect moment to tackle the man, relying on his sharp reflexes as a seasoned boxer. He didn't hold back and swiftly disarmed the man. My uncle saved us. The door swung open, and the police arrived just in time, securing the situation. They arrested the man and informed us that he was a dangerous criminal they had been hunting for some time. That day changed everything. My mom never felt comfortable being alone again and always looked over her shoulder at the windows. If it hadn't been for my uncle, I don't know what would have happened. I still shudder when I think about it. The eccentric stranger in the hotel. Kit always remembers that terrifying day. It was the day she and her family went to a small 3-star hotel in the suburbs to celebrate her sister Judy's 16th birthday. Kit's father had arranged everything, and they checked into a room on the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and since there were not enough pillows in their room, Kit had to go down to the reception to ask for more. She locked the door and headed toward the elevator. That's when she saw him. At first, she didn't notice the man sitting in the corner of the hallway because it was so dark, just a shadowed figure sitting there. As she got closer, needing to pass him to reach the elevator, she could see him more clearly. His hair was disheveled, his coat was filthy and torn, and he was muttering to himself while holding a handful of small stones, counting them one by one. As Kit walked by, she accidentally locked eyes with his bloodshot gaze, and slowly, he gave her a deranged smile. She quickly averted her eyes and hurried to the elevator. She collected the pillows from the reception and stepped into the stairwell to return to her room. The memory of the encounter sent a shiver down her spine, filling her with anxiety. As the door opened on the third floor, Kit's worst fear was confirmed. He was still sitting there, her face darkened with unease. He remained in the same spot, humming to himself as he toyed with the stones. Kit tried to walk quickly past him, but then she heard footsteps behind her. A sinking feeling hit her he was following her. She didn't dare look back again. The faster Kit walked, the quicker he followed. He began giggling, and the sound of the stones rattled throughout the hallway. She reached her sister Judy's door, but it was locked, and no one was inside. Kit didn't allow herself to stop. She sprinted straight to her parents' room. She pounded on the door frantically, nearly losing consciousness in her panic. She screamed, "Dad, please open the door," in utter desperation. But the man kept approaching. His arms reached out toward Kit as if to grab her. His long, filthy fingers were caked with dirt. Kit screamed again, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the man stopped. His demeanor changed. His head tilted as though he'd heard something strange. His eyes gleamed as he mumbled, "Dad," like the word meant something to him. Then he smiled a slow, eerie smile that made Kit's skin crawl, and he began to back away. He didn't turn around, didn't run, just slowly retreated while never taking his eyes off her, as if he was waiting, testing something with Kit. Finally, her parents opened the door, having heard Kit's screams. She rushed inside, tears streaming down her face in terror. Her father decided to search the hallway for the man. Strangely, he had vanished, disappearing quickly into the shadows. She couldn't sleep. The next morning, she was still trembling. As they went down for breakfast at the hotel, she was shocked to see 2 police cars parked outside. Her father was speaking with a police officer, his face serious. When he saw Kit, he called her over and asked her to tell the officers what she had seen the night before. She described the man in as much detail as she could. A family from the floor above had reported that their 7-year-old daughter was missing. The little girl had left her room late at night to get something from the vending machine, but never returned. The police checked the security footage, and there he was, the man Kit had seen, carrying the girl over his shoulder as he walked out of the hotel at 4 a.m. The girl appeared to be asleep, but the police believed she had been knocked unconscious. As the days went by, the memories lingered for Kit. She couldn't sleep, constantly imagining his figure sitting in the corner of her room. Even the smallest noise would send her into a panic, leaving her breathless with fear, and she no longer wanted to leave the house. Her parents eventually sought help from a therapist. The therapist explained to her that everything she was experiencing was normal after witnessing something so traumatic. It was a psychological injury, and Kit would need time to heal. As a witness, Kit followed the case closely. In the end, the case was closed without the police ever finding him. He was just a drifter, a predator. Kit wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to escape the memory of that night, but she knew she needed to move on and become stronger. Night shift nightmare. Jen was sitting at the dimly lit reception desk, trying to stay awake. She was checking the computer, reviewing her work, when suddenly, she felt someone lightly tap her on the shoulder. Startled, she turned around but found no one there. Worried, she chuckled, dismissing it as fatigue in her imagination. But a few minutes later, she felt a light but distinct tug at her hair. She froze, her hand slowly moving to the back of her head. The vague sensation of fingers lingered, as if someone was right behind her, almost unseen. She suddenly turned around again, but there was nothing. Then a book on the far end of the desk fell to the ground with a loud thud. As she shifted in her chair, Jen jumped. She focused on the book on the floor, the silence enveloping her. She shook her head to clear it and tried to brush it aside. She walked to the break room to collect herself. As she poured coffee into her cup, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. as if eyes were staring at her from the dark corner of the room. At 3:30 a.m., Jen returned to the lobby, sitting back at her desk, clutching her coffee cup. She checked the security cameras on her computer screen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. She jumped up, quickly glancing outside through the glass, but only her own reflection stared back. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, uncertain. After a tense few seconds, she unlocked it, cracked it open, and peered outside. The night air was cold and empty. Jen closed the door and returned to her desk. Trying to shake off her fear, Jenna grabbed some cleaning supplies and headed toward the pool area as requested by her manager. Her footsteps echoed as she approached the edge of the pool. Just then, she noticed a faint outline of wet footprints, as if someone had recently walked through. She fearfully brushed past it, ignoring it as if she had never seen it, and continued with her work. She bent down to pick up a few scattered leaves, floating on the surface of the water. At that moment, she felt it, a strange sensation as if a dark shadow was lurking just beneath the surface of the pool. She hurriedly tried to leave, but before she could react, something yanked hard at her ankle, pulling her down into the pool. Jen lost her balance and fell into the cold water, her body soaked. Panicked, she felt as if she were drowning. She began to flail, sputtering water, then staggered out of the pool, trembling and looking around in confusion, not understanding what was happening. Jen struggled against an invisible force, her hands clawing at the pool's edge, but she was held tightly by a weight she couldn't comprehend. Her vision began to fade when she suddenly saw a woman raising a skeletal hand, pointing directly at her, saying something like, "I hate you all," before vanishing. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, Jen summoned her last bit of strength to escape, gasping for air as she surfaced. Hair disheveled and soaked, Jen stammered as she recounted what had happened by the pool to her manager. She tried to explain how real that feeling had been, but her manager merely checked the cameras and remained skeptical. He insisted that perhaps she just slipped. To her, it was different. She knew it was more than just a slip. Back at the reception desk, Jenna sat there exhausted. She felt foolish and paranoid, wondering if her fear was just in her head, fueled by her coworkers' ghost stories. Her gaze scanned the security cameras, but she hesitated, afraid of what she might see. She quickly packed her things, not wanting to spend another minute in the building. Her shift was about to end. Jen walked out suddenly. The doorbell rang softly in the empty lobby. Her eyes glanced toward the hotel. She held her breath as she watched the front door slowly open, revealing darkness inside as if someone was standing there. But she thought it was enough and turned around to leave immediately. As she drove home, Jen realized she would have to return to work the next day. The haunting spirit would be waiting, and the cycle of fear might never end. She needed to confirm this truth. Night shift nightmare. The next day, Jen stood behind the dimly lit reception desk, her hands slightly trembling as she stared at the empty lobby. The memory of the ghostly encounter lingered in her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that she needed this job. Jen reluctantly walked towards the pool area. The flickering lights cast strange shadows, making the room feel even more frightening. She glanced at the water, fearing the woman would reappear. But the pool remained still, the surface undisturbed. Jen took a deep breath, regaining her composure for the cleaning task ahead. As she began cleaning the pool, Jen's eyes scanned the area. She didn't see the ghost. Instead, her gaze fell upon a room she had almost never noticed before, peeking out from behind a dusty curtain. She stepped inside, her eyes landing on a pile of old papers stored in the corner. Curiosity sparked. She approached and began sifting through the dust-covered documents. Among them, an old article caught her eye. The headline read, "Mysterious Murder at the Hotel. Night Staff Member Missing." The article recounted an incident nearly a year prior, where a woman was brutally murdered by one of the hotel's night staff during a blackout. The next morning, the disfigured body of the woman was found with a flower pinned to her dress, but there was no sign of the staff member responsible for the crime. Jenna's mind raced as she processed this information, piecing together the fragments of a tragic story. Determined to shake off her fear, Jen continued her work. But as she bent down to pick up leaves, she felt someone behind her. She hesitated, fear enveloping her. Standing upright, she glanced around the empty pool area, but saw nothing. Jen continued to finish her cleaning, but once again, she caught sight of a dark shadow on the water. She turned around, but it was too late. The ghost was right behind her. An eerie smile stretched across her distorted face. Jen staggered back, the ghost's laughter echoing in her ears as she was drawn into the pool. The world around her felt like an endless abyss. Jen panicked as she emerged from the water, gasping for air. It stood at the edge of the pool, looking at her with a delighted and smug expression. Soaked and gasping, Jen burst through the door. She headed toward the reception desk, ready to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for her bag, she hesitated. She recalled the wronged woman she had seen in the article had also gone missing right there. Could it be her? What if that woman needed her help? The thought lingered, gnawing at her conscience. After much inner turmoil, she decided to return. Upon reaching the pool again, Jen looked around and saw the woman standing at the edge. But then she shouted, "I will help you find him." Jen could see the woman's expression change. She slowly reached out, brushing her icy fingers across Jen's forehead. Images flooded Jen's mind. Flashes of the night of the murder, the struggle, the fear in the woman's eyes. And finally, the face of the night staff, a dim shadow emerging. She returned to the reception desk. Using the hotel's security system, Jen searched for anything unusual, scanning the old footage from that fateful night, but most of it had been nearly erased. However, he missed one scene, him entering through the back door, with small dirt clumps still scattered on the ground. It led to the large abandoned area behind the building. The next day, Jen began searching for hidden evidence. Following the woman's memories, she rummaged through the abandoned land behind the hotel. Jen continued to dig. She discovered broken branches and leftover, but nothing resembling the evidence she sought. She felt like giving up. On the second night, Jen dreamed of the ghost, her distorted face contorted in pain. She was determined to return. After nearly 2 exhausting days, just as despair threatened to consume her, Jen's shovel struck something. She dug deeper, discovering an old box. When she opened it, she found the murder weapon, a knife, and a USB that he had hidden away, intending to destroy it. He seemed to have toyed with the law, disregarding it. Jen hurried to the police station. She presented the evidence she had found. With the evidence in hand, he was identified. After so long, he was finally apprehended. Jen felt the weight lifted off her shoulders. The ghost of the woman appeared behind her, a faint smile on her distorted face. Jen returned, knowing that the woman's soul could finally find peace. She glanced back at the building, but this time she felt it had truly closed. Pharmacy obsession. It was a quiet evening. Lily had been working as a pharmacy technician for a few years. It was a simple job, filling prescriptions and dispensing medications. The pharmacy had its regular customers. Some were friendly, while others were a bit odd, but everyone got used to them. Joe was one of those regulars, a man in his mid-30s who came by often. He stood out with his long, disheveled hair and eccentric clothing. Lily had seen Joe and his elderly mother many times. She was always his caretaker, bringing Joe in to get his medication. The mix of drugs he needed included antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and a type of medicine for infectious diseases. Joe always complimented Lily and called her Kitty because she wore a pink bow hair clip. It was harmless, though strange. Lily would politely smile, chat, and give him his medication. He never made her feel unsafe. One day, Joe's mother came alone. She looked tired, older than before. She told them that Joe wasn't well. He had stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and was becoming unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. She could no longer control him. The court had declared Joe unfit to make decisions, so he was admitted to a mental health facility. Lily felt a bit sad, missing the familiar face, but relieved knowing Joe was being taken care of. For months, they didn't see Joe. The facility's staff regularly picked up his prescriptions, and life at the pharmacy went on as usual. Then, one Friday night, everything changed. It was late. Only she and another female colleague were working. The store was quiet, as it often was on Friday nights. Lily was reading a magazine at the counter. Then, she heard a voice.
Hey, Kitty.
At first, she didn't look up. After all, she wasn't Kitty, and she figured someone in the store was talking. But then the voice came again, angrier this time.
Kitty!
Suddenly, a bloodied hand slammed onto the counter in front of Lily, startling her. It was Joe, but something was wrong. He was bleeding heavily. The counter was smeared with Joe's bloody handprint. His face was pale, his eyes wild, like he had lost his mind. Her heart raced, and she slowly backed away from him. Lily's colleague, Jane, hurried over, concerned, asking what Joe was doing there since his medication had already been picked up on Tuesday. Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring at Lily, his voice soft but filled with dangerous intensity. He said he wanted to see Kitty and that he missed her. He started moving toward the waist-high door that separated the pharmacy counter from the rest of the store. Panic rose in Lily. Jane tried to calm him down, but Joe kept repeating the same demand, saying he wanted to see Kitty and telling Lily to come closer. She shook her head, fear rising inside her. She refused Joe, saying she couldn't come closer, but he didn't stop, beginning to cry and then scream. He started climbing over the counter, his bloody hands gripping the edge, leaving deep red stains on the white surface. Jane realized things were getting out of control and told Lily to hide in the storage room. Lily slammed the door shut and locked it, listening as Joe's voice turned into full-blown screams. He was throwing things all over the store in a frenzy, grabbing whatever he could reach. Blood spattered over bottles and shelves. Jane called the store manager and quickly phoned the police. Through the crack of the door, Lily could see the chaos. A few customers had gathered, staring in shock. One of them moved as if they were about to intervene. Both Lily and Jane shouted together,
"Don't touch him!"
because Joe had an infectious disease, and his blood was everywhere. Anyone who touched him would be at risk of infection. The police arrived quickly, but didn't rush in. They were wearing full protective gear, gloves, masks, and all because of Joe's blood. They cautiously approached him. At first, he resisted, screaming for Lily. But finally, the police managed to sneak behind him and sedate him. Joe collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and his bloody rampage was over. The store had to be closed. A specialized cleaning crew came to disinfect everything. A few days later, after the store reopened, Joe's mother came by to apologize. Joe was then transferred to a higher security facility where he would be more closely monitored. The smell of blood and the fear still lingered in Lily's memory. She hadn't seen Joe since that night. She heard that Joe's mother had considered suing the care facility for negligence, but she didn't follow up on what happened next. She just continued her work, but she would never forget him. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door, where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, The man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. Mysterious invitation in the basement. The warm afternoon sun spread across the school campus as the students left for the day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about that week. That was the week Justin arrived. He was a new student, showing up in the middle of the semester without warning. He was quiet, maybe a little strange, but friendly enough. He sat next to me in class because there happened to be an empty seat, and soon enough, we started talking. Justin always seemed distant, like he was hiding something and rarely talked about himself. He just said he had recently moved to our town. There was something odd about him, but I brushed it aside. I thought everyone had their quirks. A few weeks later, he invited me over to his house. I was a bit surprised by this. He told me to come around 7 p.m. I wasn't particularly excited, but I agreed. After all, he was new to town, and I thought he could use a friend. That night, I took a bus to his neighborhood and started walking to find Justin's house. His home was in a rundown area. The houses were small, and the streets were eerily quiet. The porch light was off when I arrived, and the windows were dark. I texted Justin to let him know I was there. After a minute with no reply, I moved closer to the front door. It was unlocked. I paused for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was almost pitch black. The house was silent, except for a faint noise coming from somewhere deep inside. I stood at the entrance, calling out for Justin, but there was no answer. My phone buzzed, and finally, he responded, "Come in. I'm in the basement." I went down the basement stairs. The sound of a TV or video game echoed from the basement. The basement door was slightly ajar, and the noise grew louder as I approached. I figured Justin was playing something. The basement was darker than the rest of the house, with just a faint light flickering. As I descended, the sounds of gunfire and explosions became clearer, but something felt wrong. I called out to Justin again, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. It was pitch black, except for the flicker of a TV somewhere in the distance. I moved forward, inching through the darkness, toward the faint light. I called out again, louder this time, "Justin," but still nothing. Suddenly, I felt it, a hard shove from behind. I stumbled and hit the ground face first. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I lay there for a moment, stunned. Laughter echoed through the basement. I staggered to my feet, my heart racing. I turned, trying to see who had pushed me, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then came another shove, harder this time, sending me sprawling to the floor again. The laughter started up once more. It felt like I was being toyed with. Panic hit me. My legs were trembling. Someone kicked my legs as I tried to stand, knocking me down again. I had to get out now. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the slick concrete floor. My heart pounded in my chest. Footsteps echoed behind me, and the laughter still rang in my ears. My hands fumbled in the dark, desperately searching for the railing. My foot caught on the bottom step, and I stumbled, but I managed to catch myself. I burst through the front door and ran. When I got home, I texted Justin, wanting to know what the hell had just happened, but he never responded. The next day at school, I expected him to show up and either laugh it off or offer an explanation. But Justin didn't say a word. He sat there, silent, avoiding my gaze. Then, one Monday, he was gone. His desk was empty, with no books or belongings. There were rumors that he had moved away, but no one seemed to care. But I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment I was shoved and the laughter that followed me. It felt like I was being hunted. I still wondered if it had been Justin or someone else down there with me. And then I remembered something I had overlooked in the chaos. When I first entered the basement, there were more footsteps than just mine. I didn't dare go back to Justin's house after that day. I'm glad I escaped that house. I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved and without knowing, but the questions I wonder still haunt me and push me to find them. I don't know if I should. Mysterious invitation in the basement. It's been weeks since Justin disappeared. Despite my best efforts to move on, my mind kept going back to that basement. The laughter, the shoves, the darkness. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it haunted me. There was a nagging feeling inside me I needed answers. Tonight, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and a message was sent. It seemed like spam. Hey Ken, long time no see. Just remember to stay away from it. I didn't know what the warning was about, or what I was supposed to stay away from. But my mind kept repeating, could it be Justin? I couldn't keep living with this fear. If Justin had any answers, I was going to get them tonight. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Justin's house looked just as it had when I left it, dark and unsettling. The eerie silence of the neighborhood made me anxious. The front door was ajar, just like before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, and my footsteps echoed through the empty space, each step sending chills down my spine. The fear I had felt weeks ago crept back in. I cautiously headed straight for the basement. The door was wide open. The stairs creaked beneath me as I descended into the pitch-black void. I gripped my phone tightly, using its light to guide me, but the beam barely cut through the suffocating darkness. The temperature dropped as I moved deeper inside. Slowly, I saw it something I had missed before. In the faint glow of my phone, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged and confusing like runes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my attention. I swept my phone around, and there, at the far end of the basement, I saw him, Justin. He stood still, his face pale, eyes wide, lifeless and empty, staring straight at me. My voice caught in my throat as I called his name. Justin? He didn't respond. He didn't move. Whether it was my eyes or the darkness, he seemed half visible, almost translucent in the dim light of my phone, like he wasn't even there. I cautiously moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and then the whispering began. It started small, unintelligible, but grew louder. Fear crept in. He was muttering something in a language I couldn't understand, then told me,
"You shouldn't have come back."
Suddenly, my mind was flooded with images. I wasn't in the present anymore. I was seeing something from years ago. I saw Justin standing in the basement with his strange mother. They stood around a table covered with old books and candles. Justin seemed forced into it, his face filled with fear and resignation. The candles flickered, and suddenly, Justin froze. He stared at something in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged with eyes burning like fire. The figure reached out, and in a flash, everything stopped. I was back in the present, gasping for air. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the basement. Justin's body twitched, his mouth curling into a grotesque, twisted smile as he said,
It never left. It's been waiting for you.
I tried to move, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt invisible, icy hands pulling me down. But just as I was about to be swallowed by some unseen darkness, I saw Justin, his real face. It was different from before. He looked pitiful, as if he were trapped. He whispered faintly,
Help me, please.
In that moment, it hit me. Had Justin never left the basement? Had he been trapped here all this time? I screamed his name, Justin, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I heard was the basement door slamming shut above me, locking us inside. Then I opened my eyes. I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I was in my bed, in my room, with the faint light of dawn creeping through the window. It felt like hours had passed, but when I glanced at the clock, only a few minutes had gone by. I had no idea when I had fallen asleep. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. It made me think about the questions I had sought answers for, but that dream made me stop. Was it a warning to keep me away from all of it? I think I will never go back there again. Strangers on the 6th floor. It was late, and the apartment building loomed tall against the misty sky, the dim lights flickering in the fog. The street was quiet, deserted except for the occasional sound of cars in the distance. I wanted to take a walk to get some fresh air. As I walked toward the elevator, the air suddenly turned cold, sending a shiver down my spine. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator started descending. Suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The doors slid open with a small creak, and there stood a woman. She was thin, with hollow cheeks, and her messy hair hung over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. I felt uneasy as I noticed she was barefoot, her dirty feet resting on the cold elevator floor. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if she were in pain. Her head remained down, and her movements were slow and deliberate. I moved to the other side of the elevator, holding my breath as she took her place. Something about her appearance left me feeling unsettled. Her dirty dress, her gaunt face, she looked like a homeless person. Her gaze stayed fixed on the elevator floor, scanning as if searching for something invisible, even though there was nothing there. She never looked up, her hands trembling. I began to feel afraid just looking at her. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I rushed out, not daring to look back. I quickly exited the building, trying to shake off the encounter, but questions lingered in my mind. Who was that woman? She didn't seem like she belonged here. A little while later, I returned to the building. I pressed the elevator button, eager to get back to my apartment. When the doors opened, my heart skipped a beat. She was there again. This time, she was crawling on the ground, her face pressed against the floor. Her hands frantically moved across the cold floor, still searching for something. The sight was so strange, so terrifying, that I hesitated at the entrance. For a moment, I considered taking the stairs, but something urged me to step inside. My heart raced as I pressed the button for the 9th floor. The elevator began to rise, but it stopped again at the 6th floor. The doors opened, and she crawled out, her body moving slowly along the hallway floor. I watched her disappear into the darkness, my mind spinning. What was she looking for? All night, I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. She must have been a homeless person who had lost her mind and broken into the building. I tried to convince myself that was the only explanation, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. A few days later, I woke up early for a morning run. It was still quite early, so the building and hallways were quiet. As I approached the elevator, I pressed the button, feeling a bit anxious as I remembered the woman from the other night. The elevator descended and stopped once again at the 6th floor. The doors slid open. This time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. His hair was messy, his clothes filthy. He hunched over, one hand clutching his stomach. His face was pale, his eyes vacant. He stepped into the elevator, moving slowly, as if in pain. My heart started to race. The similarities were too striking to ignore. I whispered, "Are you okay? What are you looking for?" The man turned to look at me, his eyes staring into mine. They were hollow, lifeless, his face contorted in pain. His voice was hoarse as he mumbled, "I've lost something. My stomach hurts." Before I could respond, he collapsed onto the floor, lying face down just like the woman. He started crawling, dragging his hands across the floor, searching for something invisible. Everything about it was eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I had no idea what was waiting for me next, or how I would face it. The morning sunlight shone through the dusty window as I entered the apartment management office, my nerves still on edge from the strange events of the past few days. I needed answers, anything to explain the bizarre encounters in the elevator. I entered the management office and told him about the strange things I had seen. I mentioned seeing some strange people using the elevator from the 6th floor. They looked like a homeless couple, barefoot and dirty. They always held their stomachs, as if they were in pain. The man frowned and pulled out a list of tenants. He glanced over it and then looked back at me, shaking his head. He said no such couple existed. No one matching my description lived on the 6th floor. I stood there, stunned. If no one lived there, then who were the people I had seen? Still uneasy, I headed to the mailroom, hoping that doing something simple like picking up my mail would calm my nerves. When I opened the mailbox, something caught my eye. It was the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 rooms were listed, 601 and 602, along with a water bill. One strange thing I noticed was that the water bill for room 602 was unusually high. I blinked, staring at the numbers. It didn't make sense. How could someone use that much water? Something was really off. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after a late night at work. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening on the 6th floor. As the elevator doors slid open, I froze. Inside the elevator stood a large man, holding a long, heavy golf bag. There was a strange odor, a faint metallic smell wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The button for the 6th floor was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag down the dark hallway toward room 602. I waited until he disappeared before stepping out of the elevator, my heart pounding. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark on the floor that looked like blood. I had no idea what he was carrying in that bag. Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. My mind raced, piecing together the strange encounters. The barefoot couple, the blood, the water bill. Something horrific was happening in room 602. After pacing for what felt like hours, I finally picked up the phone and called the police. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated the street outside my building. I watched from the window as the officers entered, heading straight to the 6th floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, wondering what they would find. Minutes passed, and I could only pace back and forth in my apartment, too anxious to sit down. Finally, I saw the police return. Their faces were grim, and one of them motioned for me to come down. I rushed down the stairs to meet them. I asked what they had found. They told me that inside room 602, they found a makeshift surgery room. There was blood everywhere, They also found a freezer and suspicious golf bags. Inside them were dismembered bodies. Their organs had been removed. I felt nauseous. Organ trafficking. Right in my building. I could hardly comprehend it. I also asked them about the barefoot couple I had seen in the elevator, and they said there was no one else there that matched my description. Determined to understand what had happened, I asked to see the elevator security footage. As the video played, my heart raced. I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone, talking to no one. I felt numb. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The autopsy had been completed. The victims found in room 602 were all homeless. The people I saw in the elevator were likely the spirits of the 6th floor. They had been tragically taken by criminals and were still searching for something, perhaps a part of themselves. The House of the Lost Child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day.
Mom, where are you? I'm cold.
That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard,
Mom, where are you?
I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered,
Mom, where is she?
I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate.
Where is my mom? I want to see her.
As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything. His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper.
Thank you.
I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, But he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The strangers in the elevator. It was late, and the tall apartment building loomed against the foggy sky, its dim lights flickering in the mist. The street was quiet and empty, except for the occasional sound of distant traffic. I want to take a walk to enjoy the fresh air a bit. As I walked towards the elevator, the air suddenly became cold, making me shiver. The sliding doors opened. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the first floor. The elevator began descending, but suddenly, it stopped at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened with a faint creak, and a woman was standing there. She was thin, her cheeks hollow, and her messy hair hung down over her face. Dark circles surrounded her lifeless eyes. A sense of unease crept over me as I noticed she was barefoot. She stepped inside, clutching her stomach as if in pain. Her head remained bowed, her movements slow and deliberate. I shifted uncomfortably, but something about her appearance left me confused and uneasy. Her dress was dirty, and she looked like she might be homeless. Her gaze remained fixed on the elevator floor, even though there was nothing there. When the elevator reached the 1st floor, I hurried out without even looking back. I quickly left the building. A little while later, I returned to the building, brushing off my thoughts, and stepped inside. As I pressed the button for the 8th floor, the elevator began to rise, but stopped again at the 6th floor. The elevator doors opened, and a horrifying sight greeted me. She was standing there, and I froze. Then, she began crawling frantically toward me. Panicking, I quickly pressed the close button, just in time before she could reach me, and the elevator doors shut. The next day, as I approached the elevator, a sense of anxiety washed over me. The elevator descended, stopping once again at the 6th floor. The sliding doors opened, and this time, it was a man. He was barefoot, just like the woman. I began to whisper, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man turned to look at me, his face showing pain, mumbling and then saying,
I've lost something. My stomach hurts so much.
Then he collapsed onto the floor, his hands searching the ground for something I couldn't see. Everything felt eerie and terrifying. When the doors opened, I bolted out of the elevator immediately, my whole body trembling with fear. I went to the management office, but they said no such person existed. Still unsettled, I went to the mailroom to pick up some things, and that's when I began to piece things together. When I opened my mailbox, one thing caught my eye: the maintenance bill for the 6th floor. 2 apartments were listed, 601 and 602, along with the water bill. Oddly, I noticed 602's water bill was abnormally high. A few nights later, I returned to my apartment after working late. When the elevator doors slid open, a large man was holding a long, heavy golf bag. It had a strange smell, a faint metallic tang wafting through the air. I glanced at the elevator control panel. The 6th floor button was lit. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, he stepped out, carrying the bag into the dark hallway toward apartment 602. I glanced down and saw tiny drops of something dark, like blood, on the floor. What was he carrying? Back in my apartment, I couldn't sit still. Finally, I picked up my phone and called the police. The police entered the building, heading straight for the 6th floor, to apartment 602. Inside apartment 602, they found a makeshift surgical room. Blood was everywhere. They also found a freezer and the suspicious golf bag. Inside were corpses. Their organs had been removed. The police uncovered evidence of organ trafficking taking place right in my building. At that moment, I asked them about the barefoot man and woman I had encountered in the elevator, but they said there was no one like that in the building as I described. I requested to see the elevator surveillance footage. When the video played, I saw myself in the elevator, but I was alone and talking to no one. I was frozen in shock. 3 days later, I received the final report from the police. The victims found were all homeless people. Those I encountered might have been spirit souls of those taken by the traffickers, still searching for something, perhaps pieces of their own bodies. The insatiable craving at Voodoo Donuts. A cold winter night, when the air in their quiet little town grew heavy and horrifying. Sarah was working the night shift at Voodoo Donuts, a place that always smelled of sugar and spice. But that night, the sweetness seemed suffocated. The shop felt oppressively heavy. The doorbell jingled violently as it swung open. Big Joe, a regular customer, a man with a massive frame, usually outdone only by his cheerful demeanor, had been acting differently lately. A giant donut eating contest, meant for thrill seekers, had become a nightly ritual. He'd always ask about it, wondering if anyone had completed it in under 80 seconds. But that night, he didn't just come to eat donuts. He barged in, slamming the door so hard it banged against the wall, startling everyone. He strode straight to the counter where she stood, speaking in a gruff voice.
Tonight is the night of feasts.
She shuddered at the way he spoke, as if he wasn't really talking to her but to something behind her. Sarah hesitantly slid a tray of giant donuts across the counter. Joe grabbed it with trembling hands, his lips twitching into a deranged smile. Joe sat in his usual spot, closing his eyes and muttering unintelligibly, his large hands hovering over the tray of donuts. Without warning, he began devouring them. His movements were frantic, each bite seemingly adding to the bizarre intensity of his performance. Sarah watched from behind the counter, her unease growing stronger. Joe suddenly stood up, overturning the table. Donuts spilled onto the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. He started speaking in a strange language. From behind the counter, Sarah instinctively reached for her phone. Before she could dial, Joe grabbed a kitchen knife from the prep station nearby. Joe pointed the knife at the room, his wild eyes scanning the terrified customers.
Eat, eat.
He lunged at a young man, pressing the knife to his throat. He held him tightly, the man sobbing as Joe picked up a donut and shoved it into his mouth. Sarah spotted an old fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She grabbed it tightly, stepping back into the chaos. As Joe raised the knife to strike, she stealthily lunged forward, swinging the fire extinguisher with all her might. It hit Joe's head with a horrifying thud. He staggered, dropping the knife, but didn't fall. Joe turned to face her, a low growl emanating from his throat. His eyes, full of rage, locked onto Sarah. Joe staggered toward her.
You don't understand. I am the chosen one. The feast never ends.
He picked up a donut that had fallen on the floor and shoved it into his mouth. As he ate, his breathing grew erratic. His face turned pale, sweat streaming down his forehead. Suddenly, something caught. He clutched at his chest. His massive body trembled, then collapsed to the floor with a loud thud. Silence enveloped the room. Sarah dropped the fire extinguisher. She cautiously approached Joe's motionless body, her breath ragged as she checked for a pulse. There was none. Police cars and ambulances stood outside the shop. She sat in the back of the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her. Sarah couldn't escape the image, the final moments of Joe, his madness, and the obsession with a challenge that had led to his demise. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Whispers from the mirror. I never thought that agreeing to sleep over at Thomas's house would lead to a nightmare. Thomas was always a bit odd, but as his desk mate, I'd grown used to his quiet nature. He was shy, and our conversations were mostly one-sided, with me doing most of the talking. Thomas was shy and strangely odd, but over time he began to open up. He smiled more often, though there was something unsettling about his smile that I couldn't shake off. One day, out of the blue, Thomas invited me to sleep over at his house. At first, I hesitated, but my curiosity about his mysterious family got the better of me. But as soon as I arrived, something felt off. Thomas's parents greeted me with the same unsettling smile he had, their eyes unnaturally wide. They were overly polite, and their voices held a forced cheerfulness that gave me chills throughout dinner. I could hardly focus on the food because I kept hearing something strange. A faint, distant crying, as if a child was sobbing somewhere in the house. No one else seemed to notice. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was so persistent that I finally had to ask Thomas. He just shrugged, his expression unreadable, and told me not to worry. After his parents went to bed, Thomas turned to me with a big grin and asked,
Do you want to meet my old friend?
His tone was cheerful, but something about it made me hesitate. I thought about it for a moment, but I didn't want to seem scared or cowardly. So I nodded. trying to hide my unease. We tiptoed down the dark hallway, the only light coming from the moon outside. I was most surprised by the Donovan family's apparent fascination with mirrors, lining them along the hallway walls. At the end of the hallway, we stopped in front of a large object covered by a cloth. The sobbing sound grew louder, echoing off the walls. Thomas stopped and whispered,
Don't worry. If he looks at you, just make sure you look away quickly, and you'll be fine.
I didn't understand what he meant, but before I could ask, he pulled off the cloth, revealing an ornate mirror. Its intricate carvings wound around the frame like vines, but the most unsettling part was the sound of the crying. It seemed to come from within the mirror itself. I stared, as if hypnotized, as my reflection faded. Instead, a boy stood there, a boy I didn't recognize. I wanted to believe it was some kind of optical illusion, but then the boy turned and slowly started walking toward me. "Who is that, Thomas?" I asked him, but Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there with a puzzled smile. His face looked stretched and distorted like in a funhouse mirror, his lips curving into a strange smile as he reached out, pressing his hand against the glass. Suddenly, his fingers started pushing through the surface of the mirror, reaching toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Thomas yanked me away, shouting at me to look away. He pulled my arm, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath as I moved away from the mirror. His laughter echoed faintly, then faded as he slipped back deep into the mirror. We hurried back to Thomas's room, where he quickly locked the door behind us. Then we climbed into bed. When Thomas finally fell asleep, I lay there, my mind spinning. I had to get out of that house. I quietly slipped out of bed and headed for the door. Footsteps echoed behind me. Panicked, I hid behind the nearest door, peeking through a crack. Mr. Donovan, Thomas's father, walked past, holding a mirror. His voice echoed down the hallway.
He's gone.
Without another thought, I rushed down the hall, desperate to escape. Around me, mirrors reflected different terrified faces, followed by the wailing cries of children. I finally reached the garage, slammed the door shut behind me, and grabbed my bike. I pressed the button to open the garage door. As soon as the door opened, I saw Mr. Donovan standing in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. He lunged toward me, stumbling in his haste, and the mirror he was holding slipped from his hand. It shattered on the floor into pieces. Long, bony arms reached out from the shards, grabbing Mr. Donovan. His screams echoed through the garage as the hands pulled him into the broken glass. Terrified, I jumped on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, leaving the house and the horrors inside it behind me. I didn't stop until I was far from the Donovan house. When I finally looked back, the house was just a distant silhouette. Strangers in the online classroom. Online classes have now become a part of our academic lives, and no matter how much I try to adapt, I still prefer in-person learning because it helps me focus better. I live alone in a small rented apartment, away from my family. That day, my last class ended at 9 p.m. I pretended to pay attention, but in reality, I was scrolling through my phone under the desk, sipping on an energy drink to stay awake. The lecture went on, and I barely listened. The class was about to end, and as soon as my teacher logged out, a few friends and I decided to stick around and chat. We were joking around, unwinding after a long day when suddenly, something strange happened. The familiar sound of someone joining the conversation echoed through my headphones. A new name appeared, Tim OO. None of us knew who this was, but we thought it was just one of our friends playing a prank on us. At first, it was funny. We laughed, waiting for them to reveal their identity. The camera on this new person's feed turned on, but the screen was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and all we could hear was heavy, raspy breathing through the microphone. One of my friends, Thomas decided to break the tension by mocking the situation. He joked.
Oh no, I'm so scared.
Our laughter was forced, half-hearted at best. Then the stranger spoke. The voice didn't sound entirely human. It was deep, distorted, as if they were using a voice modulator. My body went cold and my skin tingled with fear. The laughter stopped. No one said a word. Thomas asked, his voice trembling.
Who are you?
I wanted to believe it was still a joke, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The screen shifted. Something moved forward. Now I could see more, just enough to make out a face. But the face was wrong. It was distorted, twisted. One eye was higher than the other, and the mouth curved into a bizarre grin. The low-resolution camera made it even creepier, as if the features were shifting, morphing before my eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mask, but it didn't look like one. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. We were frozen, staring at this grotesque figure, unable to look away. Then the stranger spoke again, this time calling Thomas by name. I got goosebumps when he said,
"Because you've been so mean to me, I'll punish you first."
Thomas turned pale. His nickname in the chat was just Student 17. There was no way this person could know his real name. My mind was spinning. Who was this person? How did they know Thomas's name? I could hear him gasping through the mic, his voice shaking as he stammered.
How do you know my name?
The screen flickered again, and the image disappeared. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, trying to make out the faint image. I messaged Thomas in a private chat, asking if he was okay, but fear gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just a joke? What if that person knew where Thomas lived? What if they knew where I lived? Wet, dragging footsteps echoed through the speakers, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure leaned in, its grotesque face filling the screen. The camera was now so close that I could see every horrifying detail: cracked and peeling skin, hollow, white, soulless eyes. We screamed in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I shouted for Thomas to log out and escape. Without hesitation, we shut the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I double-checked, quickly locking all the windows and doors. I grabbed my phone to check on Thomas, to make sure he was okay. But as I did, I felt something in my room. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deformed, decaying face staring at me from the darkness. Even though the call had ended, the fear lingered. The next morning, I texted Thomas, and a wave of relief washed over me when he finally replied. He was safe. Nothing had happened to him overnight, but none of us could shake the lingering terror. We told our teacher about what had happened, but no one could explain it. And just like my classmates, no one confessed to playing this prank. No one could tell us who Tim OO was or how he had entered our chat. Days passed, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. Every time I logged into class, I checked the participants list. I still couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Maybe he was out there, watching us. Horror story about the rocking chair. My name is Jonathan, and there was a time when I frequently experienced severe sleep disorders. I often woke up in a vegetative state. Every time I lay down to sleep, nightmares would come. It started when I woke up at night feeling trapped in my body. I could see, feel, and hear everything around me, but I couldn't act. Gradually, it became more complex. One night, I woke up and found myself standing near the bed, looking at myself. I can't describe how terrified I was. I decided to see a psychologist. Drive. Beman gave me sedatives and said that over time, it would go away. And I would have to learn how to improve my sleep. I followed his instructions, and within a month, I was quite good. But suddenly, things got worse. Since I had just moved in, I didn't have much furniture. Besides the sofa, there was a TV set, a table lamp, and a rocking chair. It was in the apartment before I moved in. I kept it as an extra seat for myself. One night, I fell asleep on the living room sofa. I woke up feeling trapped, but this time, I saw someone sitting in the rocking chair, rocking back and forth. The feeling of suffocation, like being pinned down, was overwhelming me. The scariest part was knowing. I was awake, but also knowing I was seeing something that didn't exist. I saw a woman, around 70 years old, and there was no one else in the apartment but me. She didn't face me or make any sound, just rocking back and forth. It must have been my imagination because as soon as I snapped out of that state, the woman disappeared. I went to see my psychologist and talked about it, and he also said it was just a hallucination. I learned to meditate before going to bed because it would help my sleep, and I did it for a few weeks. I felt reassured that I had stopped experiencing these things until one night. That day, I was comfortable and relaxed for the first time in a long time with my friend. My friend Ren stayed over that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard heavy breathing from a very close distance. As soon as I opened my eyes, I saw a horrifying face leaning towards me, staring straight into my eyes. Her thin white hair was all over me. It was the woman rocking in the chair. I tried to call out, but my voice was choked. My lips couldn't move. I let out a weak groan that sounded like the moan of a zombie. I wanted to scream. I thought I was dead. My fear also subsided. I gradually became aware of my breathing. The woman then said to me, "Go away, run away." I gasped, unable to breathe from the shock. She stood up and began to circle around me hungrily. Her jaw started to elongate into a large gaping mouth, then disappeared into the darkness. I jumped up and screamed, startling Ren, who had no idea what was wrong with me. Ren woke up in shock.
What the hell, man? What's going on?
I fainted before I could say anything. Everything felt so real, but no one believed me. The doctors thought I had a panic attack in my sleep due to intoxication. I was kept under special care for a week. After hearing her words, I moved to a new place, but before leaving, I shared my story. I also asked the landlord about the history of the rocking chair. He said that many years ago, this apartment was a healthcare unit for people with mental disorders. She just liked to be alone and rocked the chair day after day. She hated noise and disturbance and passed away right in that chair. After that, I left because of her warnings. That was probably the last time I saw her. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roll? In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. The hitchhiker's nightmare. The chilly spring air bit at my skin. It was a quiet night as I left the Subway restaurant. The shopping mall where the Subway was located was desolate, except for a few dim streetlights casting pale circles of light over the empty parking lot. Though the place was somewhat old and empty, the quality was decent, and it was only a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house. As I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man walking past the stores. He was tall, disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a dingy t-shirt. As he passed by the window, he glanced at me. It was only a brief look, but something about him left me feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy. I pushed open the door, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking the short distance to my car. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were faint, but they quickly grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, And there he was, the man from earlier. He was walking toward me, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. I stopped, unsure of what he wanted. He was too close for comfort. He asked me for a ride to the gas station just down the street. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as he pointed toward a gas station nearby, visible from where we stood. It didn't seem far, and it was on my way home. Though I hesitated, the cold air and his seemingly urgent demeanor convinced me to agree. I got into my car, and the man sat in the passenger seat. I drove out of the parking lot, down the empty streets, making the short drive to the gas station. Neither of us said a word. The entire time, something felt off about the situation. I kept telling myself everything was fine, it was just a quick ride, after all. When we arrived at the gas station, I parked in the back of the lot. I expected him to get out right away, but he didn't. Seconds passed in uncomfortable silence, and my anxiety grew. I said, "All right, we're here," trying to sound casual, hoping he would leave, but he didn't move. The man stared straight ahead, making no move to get out of the car. My heart started pounding as I repeated myself, this time more firmly. "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" Finally, he spoke. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly, but cold, almost irritated. He told me this wasn't the right gas station, and that he needed to go to a different one farther away. I glanced at the gas station in front of us, confused and worried. I was sure this was the place he pointed to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told him I wasn't going any farther and that I needed to go home. The man didn't reply. He just sat there, silent. The tension in the car was building, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I asked him to get out, my voice now shaky. He refused and said no. I glanced around the gas station, looking for someone who might help. A few cars were parked under the bright lights, but I didn't dare move. He seemed stubborn, and I was scared he might harm me. I felt trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in on me. Suddenly, a noise broke the tension, a car door slamming nearby. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a woman stepping out of her car, walking toward the gas station store. Seeing someone else, even from a distance, gave me a brief surge of courage. I turned back to him, my voice stronger this time. "I need you to get out of my car, right now." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he wouldn't get out until I took him where he needed to go. I couldn't take him anywhere else, and I couldn't sit there any longer with the fear gnawing at me. I glanced back at the gas station, hoping someone would look my way, but no one did. I needed an exit, and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to act as casual as possible. I said, "Okay," to buy myself some time, pretending to check the GPS for the other gas station he claimed he wanted to go to. He said nothing, but his eyes never left me. As my hand fumbled for the phone in my pocket, I could feel his gaze, watching my every move. My heart raced as I unlocked my phone, pretending to look up directions. In reality, I was opening the keypad. My mind raced, calculating how quickly I could call for help without him noticing. But before I could act, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my wrist. Panic exploded in my chest. He squeezed my wrist painfully as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. I tried to pull away, but he held me tight. His voice was cold, threatening, telling me not to even think about it. I froze. My breath became shallow as I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. The gas station lights cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more terrifying. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car pulling into the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the parking lot. The other man must have seen it too, because his hand suddenly loosened my wrist. Without warning, he let go of my wrist, opened the door, and got out of the car. He didn't look back, just walked quickly into the darkness behind the gas station. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me, but I was too shaken to focus on the pain. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without looking back, I drove out of the parking lot and onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, my mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into my memory. What did he want? What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up? One thing was certain, I would never make the mistake of letting a stranger into my car again. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the silence of my car for a long time, staring out at the empty street. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to fully feel the fear. After resting for a bit, I was scrolling through the web to calm my nerves when I stumbled upon Complaint and wanted reports about a man who looked exactly like the one I had encountered. He was known for tricking people into giving him rides, then using various methods to steal something. He wanted after following his victims. Using the phone number I found in the article, I immediately reported to the local police where I last saw him, right that same night. Thank God, I realized how lucky I was to have escaped that mysterious man and survived. Lucky that the police had been there. Lucky that I hadn't driven him farther and made it home safely. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. The stalker in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot. It was just an ordinary morning. My usual routine. A quick coffee stop at Dunkin' Donuts before heading to work. I don't go there every day, only when I feel like treating myself. Today, I decided to visit my usual spot. The store was busy, as expected, with the familiar noise of orders and chatter filling the space. I lined up, placed my order, and within minutes, I had my coffee in hand. As I stepped out of Dunkin', the sun was high, and the parking lot was crowded. People were rushing off to work, grabbing breakfast, nothing unusual, except for one thing. There was a man standing near my car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, near the passenger seat, wearing a black coat, with his head slightly tilted as if listening to something. I tried not to think too much about it. People do weird things sometimes, right? Maybe he was just waiting for someone. I pressed the unlock button on my remote, the faint beep cutting through the quiet, and I headed for the driver's seat. The plan was simple. Get in, start the car, drive off, and forget about it. As soon as I got inside, an uneasy feeling ran down my spine. I put the key in the ignition, and just as I was about to start the car, the passenger door opened. The man got in. For a second, I just stared, frozen in disbelief. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring out the window. My heart raced. I didn't understand what was happening. I turned to him, my voice shaky. "I think you're in the wrong car." Silence. He didn't even acknowledge me. The tension was palpable. I said it again, louder this time. "You're in the wrong car." Still nothing. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, detached. That's when the fear set in. I told him to get out or I'd call the police. My voice was firmer now, desperate. And then it happened. Without warning, he turned toward me, glaring. His hand shot toward the ignition, and before I could react, he grabbed my keys. For a moment, he struggled. He held my keys in a tight grip, and before I knew what was happening, he swung at me, using the keys as a weapon. He swung it toward my face. I dodged, but I knew I had to get out of there. I pushed open the driver's door and bolted. I ran, gasping, panicking, not stopping until I was back inside Dunkin' Donuts. I grabbed my phone and called 911, barely able to explain what had just happened. Through the large glass windows of the store, I saw him driving off in my car, disappearing down the street. The next few minutes were a blur. The police arrived, took my statement, and I filled out a report, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. A few hours later, I received news. The police discovered my car by the woods in an empty state, and no one was in it. But something felt off. Even after I got my car back, the image of him sitting silently in the passenger seat, his vacant expression, lingered in my mind. Who was he? Why had he chosen my car? Weeks had passed since that strange man entered my car, and every visit to Dunkin' Donuts filled me with discomfort. Today was no different. I stood in line, ordered my coffee, and tried to convince myself that everything would be fine, that he wouldn't come back. It was early evening when I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. I scanned the area, my eyes instantly locking onto a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was him. This time, he didn't have that vacant look. Instead, he stood there, head tilted, grinning eerily and waving at me as if teasing. A chill ran down my spine. My heart raced in my chest as I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Somehow, he didn't chase after me. Instead, he casually opened the passenger door and sat back inside my car with that same blank expression. This time, he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at me through the windshield as if waiting for something. I began to call the police. They arrived within minutes. I stepped aside, watching them cautiously approach the vehicle. The man remained still. He sat there, his emotionless eyes fixed ahead, oblivious to the events unfolding around him. One of the officers commanded him to step out of the car. For a moment, it seemed like he ignored their orders. But then, he slowly turned his head, his expression oddly calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, raising his hands as if surrendering. A few hours later, I sat in the police station, recounting the incident as if it was the 100th time. My arm still throbbed with old bandages covering the cuts from the key. They told me he had been arrested, and after taking his fingerprints, they discovered he had a long history of mental illness. His records showed he had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. His delusions had worsened over time, and it seemed he had fixated on me for reasons no one could explain. They said he saw things, heard voices screaming incoherently when there was nothing around. They believed he couldn't distinguish reality from fantasy. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with sadness. The man who had terrorized me was not just a criminal. He was sick. His mind had warped reality into something unrecognizable, and I had become part of that nightmare. As I left the police station, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my car, staring out the window, detached from the world. He had been arrested, and the officers assured me he would be taken back to a mental facility where he could receive the treatment he desperately needed. But the scars he left, both physical and mental, would take much longer to heal. I stood next to the car, hesitating to open the door, reluctant to sit in the driver's seat where everything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to unlock the door and get into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot, determined to move forward. After all, everything was finally over. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse, but just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. Underground parking and mysterious people. I work the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seems simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere, just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle it was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar. Just like that night, I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. Who are you? Why did you do this? The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I'm not like you. I can still get out of this. His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Trained to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rai found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes, his lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rai broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure.